Hello and welcome back to the Book of Revelation, Historicist View. This is part 9, Sixth Seal, the Tables Turned. Today we'll be seeing the beginning of God's vengeance on the Roman beast. And I don't know about you, but I'm ready for it because last time we saw the souls under the altar of the fifth seal of martyrdom. Saints who had been slain in 9 persecutions under the Roman emperors, culminating in one final and the most ruthless of all under Emperor Diocletian. That lasted 10 years, and it was responsible for more bloodshed than the preceding 9 persecutions. Now, no doubt the fifth seal was Rome's retaliation against God's judgments of the 4 horsemen. We saw them blame Christians for the war, the bloodshed, even the economic crash and natural disasters like earthquakes and floods. But we also saw God telling the martyrs to wait just a little longer because he's going to take revenge on those who touched the apple of his eye. Well, today we see the beginning of that vindication. I'm glad that you've joined me. Let's get started. Now we find some of the details of the symbolism of this seal in Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 through 14. And I beheld, when he had opened the 6th seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell into the earth, even as a fig tree casts forth her untimely figs when shaken by a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it's rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Well, that's a lot going on in just one judgment. So we're going to tackle the symbols themselves first, and then when we get to the interpretations, we'll come back and revisit each symbol one at a time. But for those expecting a literal fulfillment, you have to agree this sounds like the end of the world. And yet, there are over 2/3 of the book of Revelation left. So this can't possibly be the end of the world. You have to apply, as I've said all along, the symbolic and historicist view to get the right interpretation. And you'll also have to agree that the annals of history hold vast amounts of recorded evidence, really, for events that you might call etch-a-sketch events that changed the entire world. It's happened many times, and it's going to happen again, actually. In fact, if, like me, you think that the current world situation is too big for those who purport to be in control, then you already know that our great God and King is the only one who could make use of the chaos we see around us. I submit he's the one behind this dizzying pace of change that we see. What some sense as the beginning of the book of Revelation or the beginning of tribulation, well, it actually quite fits nicely with the end of the book. Evil's one last hurrah before Messiah's return. So as I said, there's a lot in this seal to discuss. There's a lot of things happening on the earth. A lot of things are happening in the sky. But Mr. Barnes, the Bible commentator, lays the foundation for the single event, the earthquake, which is going to be described in all of its accompanying symbols. He says, all the symbols represented in the opening of this seal denote consternation, commotion, and changes. But still they're all significant, and we are to suppose that something would occur corresponding with each one of them. Now that might seem like a tall order, but isn't that the point of prophecy? That only a God could lay out beforehand this type of revelation to reveal his omniscient character and nature? We're going to begin with this earthquake, the symbolism of it. This is the first earthquake in the book, but it certainly will not be the last. And as I discussed in my video about symbolism, earthquakes represent change, but not just change, a complete overturning of all earthly order. Government, religion, society, economy, and worldview. We should expect really big changes in these areas. Next, we see the sun and moon incorporated as a symbol of this seal. Now remember, the sun and moon have been traditionally viewed as symbols representing earthly rulers. Now this might be pharaohs or Caesars, certainly emperors, and even maybe presidents, those who rule earthly kingdoms. We've also talked about the conditions in which these heavenly bodies have been described as not giving their light, or turning black in color, or turning into blood. These are pictures, and they're meant to invoke meanings in a natural, scientific, and historical context. These celestial bodies we're going to see have been eclipsed. And that is a very specific detail that we need to find our place in time. Moving on to the stars of heaven falling to the earth and the sky departing like a scroll rolled up. Well, we've already determined that according to the Historicist view, stars symbolize angelic beings, but here they seem to be falling from their heavenly abode. And notice that the heavens depart not by the being unrolled or unfurled, but rolled up as if whatever it represents is finished, not beginning. End of story, so to speak. Ephesians 6, chapter 6, verse 12 teaches us that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. These therefore represent principalities or rulers of the air. And then John is told that every mountain and island is moved out of its place. Now again, this isn't the same as the other occurrence we've been talking about in chapter 16 of the book of Revelation. There the islands flee and you can't even find the mountains. Now these are simply displaced. In fact, they're rearranged. And this again is a very specific detail that helps us to check our position on that timeline. Last but not least, we see in the last 3 verses, we're told that the kings of the earth and the great men, the rich men, the chief captains, the mighty men, and every bondman and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? So all the men, that would be people, of the earth, I suggest that's the unbelievers, they go into hiding. And you have to ask, what's got them running so scared? What is the history behind this seal? Now, as we attempt to discuss the Historicist interpretation, I want to begin with saying that we have been looking at the history of the Roman Empire and using several historical sources, one of which is the work of Edward Gibbon, the English historian and scholar who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's a continuous narrative from the 2nd century all the way to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. It's a very extensive work, and it's aptly titled The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Christine Miller, in The Revelation of Jesus Christ Revealed, emphasizes this decline. She says the 6th seal completes the decline of the Roman Empire, which the 1st through 5th seals have been bringing about. We must remember, she says, that the Roman Empire is the terrible 4th beast that Daniel saw, which the little stone, the lamb who was slain, struck it in its feet and toppled, according to Daniel. John is seeing its decline. Now, interestingly enough, according to Collins' online dictionary, the Roman Empire actually rates a place in its definition: a failing or gradual loss, as in strength, character, power, or value. A deterioration, as in the decline of the Roman Empire. For those of you old enough to know what an etch-a-sketch is, you'll understand why I used that analogy earlier. With just a vigorous shake, you get to undo the whole picture and begin again. The term has become synonymous with erase or do over. And in this seal, we're going to see events that make Rome ripe for its fall, which the trumpet judgments are going to bring about. But already from the use of the symbolism of a great earthquake, we should expect to see a complete overturning or etch-a-sketch of earthly order. It's in the other symbols that we find the details of those changes. But suffice it to say, in a nutshell, the historicist view, the interpretation of the Sixth Seal earthquake, was the geopolitical and religious changes under Emperor Constantine that not only ended the persecution of Christians and granted them equal rights under the law, but set the stage for many things to be built upon in the future. Adam Clarke, the Bible commentator of 1817, says of this earthquake, a most stupendous change in the civil and religious constitution of the world. If it referred to Constantine the Great, the change that was made by his conversion to Christianity might be very properly represented under the emblem of an earthquake and the other symbols mentioned in this and the following verses. So, one of the accompanying details of this earthquake is that the sun and the moon are affected. And this is also our first occurrence of that happening, but it will not be the last. And Christine Miller reminds us that if the sun and moon are rulers over this world, then symbolically, the sun and moon represent the rulers of earthly kingdoms at this epoch, and that would be the Roman emperors. Now, Christine gets this idea from Genesis chapter 1, verse 16, where God made the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. But somehow these symbols have to be connected to the emperors on earth, or this is just mere speculation, unless we can show that some event occurred in the governmental structure of the Roman Empire that would parallel a solar or a lunar eclipse. It would be even better if we could show both. And in fact, I think we can. Let's talk about the Roman Tetrarchy. Now, you'll remember Diocletian. He was the emperor during the Fifth Seal, ruthlessly persecuting Christians. But James Breasted, in his Ancient Times, A History of the Early World, shines a little more light on the man. He says, as a divinity, the emperor had now become an oriental sun god, and he was officially called the Invincible Sun, Sol Invictus. His birthday was on the 25th of December. That is about the date when the sun each year begins to turn northward after it's reached its southernmost limit. Now, the inhabitants of each province might revere their particular gods undisturbed by the government, but all were obliged as good citizens to join in the official sacrifices to the head of the state as a god. Now, we also saw last time that Diocletian realized the size of his vast empire and the political chaos of the recent past was going to be a problem, especially for him, because he resided mostly in Asia Minor. So we're told by Mr. Breasted that he therefore appointed another emperor to rule jointly with himself, to give his attention to the west. The second emperor was to live at Milan in the Po Valley, really the most important region of Italy. All government edicts, whether issued in the east or the west, were signed by both emperors. He tells us it really wasn't Diocletian's intention to divide the Roman Empire, but the final result, nevertheless, was the division of the Roman Empire into the east and the west. Now, again, what's very important here is we've just been told that the emperors have abandoned Rome. Diocletian lives in Nicomedia in Asia Minor, and Maximian, who is his co-emperor at this point, is living in Milan. Now, Rome has always been the home of the emperors. This is important because it's actually the beginning of clearing the way for the Antichrist. Rome is vacant. Also, to avoid the recurrence of the civil war that happened every time an emperor died, Diocletian, he wanted to arrange the transfer of power from one emperor to the next. And so we're told that he and his fellow emperor, each bearing the title of Augustus, the two Augustuses appointed two subordinates to be called Caesars. So there were two emperors, or Augustuses, and two subordinate emperors, or Caesars. They were intended to be something like vice presidents. Can you see the picture here of greater and lesser lights, greater and lesser rulers? Well, the history continues that after the persecution began in 303, Diocletian became afflicted with a severe illness, and he actually had to abdicate his throne just a couple of years later. So we see that the sun emperor did not shine for very long. Next, I want us to look at this idea of eclipse, because that's key to understanding how this part of the seal, this symbolism, fits the history. Now, the first definition here of the word eclipse is the one we're all used to. This is where the sun and the moon are eclipsed in the sky by some other celestial object. In other words, something has to get in the way to cover or to eclipse another object. The second definition is how the word can be used in other ways, and it means a loss of power, success, or popularity. Like a civilization can be eclipsed, or television can be eclipsed by radio. People can be eclipsed by other people. That's going to be key. And Christine Miller from the Revelation of Jesus Christ Revealed says, what better symbolism to describe the dual state of the Roman emperors in this period than the sun and the moon, especially since Diocletian obligingly deigns to represent himself as such, the invincible sun, 200 years after the vision is given to John. And that's pretty incredible. Now, I want to look at the Tetrarchy. We've talked about it, we've mentioned it, but I really want to look at the details of this. Now, this is just a picture of a sculpture that people believe was probably once formed decorations, maybe even in the public square of Constantinople back in 300 AD. But it's been since then removed or cut away from the pillars that they used to be attached to and affixed to this single corner of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, Italy. Most scholars believe that this represents the Tetrarchy, or the four rulers of Rome. And again, I want to quickly recap this story or go over it because I think this is the point that John is trying to make by telling us that the sun and moon have been eclipsed. So we remember that Diocletian had to choose another emperor, and he chose Maximian to help rule his vast empire. They both ruled as Augustuses. And they both chose subordinate rulers, or Caesars, to help make the transfer of power easy should one of them die. Diocletian chose Galerius, it was his son-in-law. Maximian chose Constantius. But in 305, as we said earlier, Diocletian became severely ill and abdicated his throne. The interesting part is that he forced Maximian, his co-emperor, to do the same. And that elevated both Galerius and Constantius to the rank of Augustus. Diocletian, of course, favored Galerius over Constantius, and so he actually gave him 3/4 of the empire to rule, leaving Constantius with only 1/4 of the empire. Actually, if you remember back when we talked about the persecutions, we talked how the persecutions were greater in the east. Well, this is really why. Constantius in the western part of the empire was able to somewhat protect the Christians, and it'll kind of become obvious in a little bit why that was. But nevertheless, in 306, Constantius dies, and his legions, who are very loyal to him, immediately proclaim his son Constantine his successor to the throne. Now, Galerius isn't happy about this, and in retaliation, he raises his Caesar, Flavius Severus, to Augustus in Constantius's place. But he does agree to keep Constantine as Severus's Caesar to appease the army. This is where it kind of gets interesting. Maximian, who had been forced to retire, along with Diocletian, had a son named Maxentius, and Maxentius chose now to revolt. He declares himself emperor in the place of Severus. Severus commits suicide, and Maximian comes out of retirement to join his son. Well, this kind of leaves a sort of triumvirate in the West, and Galerius, not wanting to be upstaged, kind of forms his own triumvirate in the East. But you know what they say about the number 3? It's always crowded. And Maximian, having held the imperial rule once before, wasn't really satisfied with merely having a third of the quarter of an empire. And so the story goes that he argues with his son Maxentius in Rome and then flees to Constantine, where he's found to be plotting against Constantine, and he's put to death. Well, this leads to eventual war between Maxentius and Constantine, and in 312 AD, it's settled by Constantine's victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Shortly after that, Licinius, the new Augustus of the East, he joins Constantine really in establishing religious toleration within the Roman Empire through the Edict of Milan. But the very next year, civil war breaks out between Licinius and Constantine, and the next 10 years are going to be dotted with warring and truces. It's actually going to take 12 years before Constantine rules supremely as the sole emperor of the Roman Empire in 324 AD. Christine Miller of the Revelation of Jesus Christ Revealed tells us, thus Diocletian's dual emperor system was completely discarded, and his chosen successors completely defeated in battle by the Christian champion. The sun and the moon, we see, are indeed in total eclipse. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about why she refers to him as the Christian champion when we talk a little bit more about that Battle of the Milvian Bridge. But first, let's address the stars falling from the heavens and the sky departing like a scroll. Sometimes, we need a little history lesson within our history lesson, and that's exactly what Christine Miller is going to give us right now when she reminds us that the symbolism of the stars, the sky, and the heavens have to do with spiritual powers and the heavenly realm, as opposed to earthly powers and the worldly realm. Now here's the history lesson part. She reminds us that religion in the Roman world, and really since the establishment of Babel by Nimrod, had been paganism. Nimrod had exchanged the truth about God for a lie, worshiping and serving the creature rather than the creator. He elevated the heavens and earth itself to divinity, calling it Father Heaven and Mother Earth. Now, this is so important. She's telling us that over 4,200 years ago, Babylonian sun god worship took prominence in the world. I happen to think that's one of the reasons that God chose Abraham. He wanted to establish a people who would be filled with the truth, who could re-educate the world, if you will. He had to pluck Abraham out of the midst of that pagan culture. But it's going to be another 2,000 years before that truth will spread beyond Israel's borders. That's what you and I are seeing right here, and that's why it's such a big deal. These stars or principalities falling to earth. All right, let's talk a little bit more about that battle. SciHi.org tells us that on October the 28th, 312 AD, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge between the Roman emperors Constantine I and Maxentius took place. Constantine won the battle and started on the path that led him to end the Tetrarchy and become the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. According to historians, the battle marked the beginning of Constantine's conversion to Christianity and thus fostered the rise of Christianity. We're told that on his way to battle Maxentius, The legend goes Constantine saw the vision of a brilliant cross appearing in the sky, surrounded by the words in hoc signo vinces, meaning by this sign conquer. Constantine was so moved by this vision, it's said that he vowed to become a Christian if he won the day. Now, this history has been corroborated in many places. One such place is historytoday.com. They tell us quite a bit more, though. They say the story first was generated by Eusebius of Caesarea. He was a Christian biblical scholar and historian who actually wrote the biography of Emperor Constantine shortly after the emperor died. He knew the emperor personally and supposedly had the story from the emperor himself. He goes on to tell us that Constantine was a pagan monotheist, a devotee of the sun god Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Then he tells us that they saw the cross of light in the sky with the words, in this sign conquer. But he adds, that night, Constantine had a dream in which Christ told him he should use the sign of the cross against his enemies. He was so impressed that he had the Christian symbol marked on his soldiers' shields. And when the Milvian bridge battle gave him an overwhelming victory, he attributed it to the God of the Christians. Vigorously promoting Christianity, Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD proclaimed that no one should be denied the opportunity to give his heart to the observance of the Christian religion. He appointed Christians to high office and gave Christian priests the same privileges as pagan ones. And by AD 323, the birthday of Sol Invictus on December 25th had become the birthday of Christ. Now, contrary to what some may think, Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. His edict merely elevated Christians to equal status under the law with pagans. It's going to be another 67 years before Theodosius I accomplishes that feat. Although paganism had not been outlawed, so great a number of people became Christians and joined the church that the pagan temples were converted to churches or went to ruin. So much so that in 331 AD, all the pagan temples in Rome which had not been converted to churches were destroyed. History tells us next that Constantine's nephew Julian came to the throne in 361 AD. He had been raised a Christian but had reverted to paganism. He didn't rule long, only 2 years before being killed in a battle. But in those 2 years, he attempted to undo everything that his uncle had done. He closed churches and reopened pagan temples. He even forced Christian soldiers to give up or renounce Christianity or be dismissed. No wonder he's known in history as Julian the Apostate. And ThoughtCo.com tells us what happened next. In 363, when Julian died, he was succeeded by Jovian, a Christian, at least nominally, instead of the obvious choice, Julian's Praetorian prefect, the moderate polytheist. No other pagan emperor came to power before the Roman state outlawed pagan practices. Even so, they say, 1700 years later, we continue to be predominantly a Christian society in terms of our beliefs. It may have been the pagan attitude of religious tolerance that prevailed. Can anyone say amen to that? We're pretty tolerant. And finally, Christine Miller tells us that thus we see that Christianity had made such gains from 313 to 361, a span of less than 50 years, that all the efforts and the authority of the emperor could not restore paganism, the system which had been in place for over 2 millennia. Traditionally, the church has called the earthquake of the sixth seal the fall of paganism. Truly, the stars of the sky fell to the earth like a fig tree dropping its unripe figs when shaken by a fierce wind. The spiritual powers that had reigned up until this time were rent asunder as a scroll being rolled up. Next, we're going to talk about the historical fulfillment of every mountain and island being moved out of its place. Now, if you haven't seen video 3, the greatest literary work of all time, be sure to go back and catch that. It details the scriptural evidence of some of the symbolism used in the book of Revelation. And there we cover that mountains represent kingdoms and islands represent nations to the uttermost ends of the world. Now, this is the first occurrence in the book of Revelation of mountains being moved. But they don't disappear like they do in Revelation 16, where the islands flee and the mountains can't be found. They're just moved out of their places. And as I said earlier, this is a significant detail. It might seem a small one, but it helps us to pinpoint very accurately the fulfillment of the seal. We're not looking for these kingdoms to be destroyed or overcome or conquered, just displaced, as I said before, rearranged. And once again, the revelation of Jesus Christ revealed tells us that the old Roman Empire took existing nations and people under its authority without changing things too much. They acted just as the empires of the Greeks, Persians, and Babylonians, which had come before them, had. The nation might have a Roman governor, it might garrison Roman troops, it's definitely going to pay taxes to Rome, but its native nobility and civilization were often maintained in place. Thus, for all appearances, life went on much as it had, as long as proper respect, deference, and tribute were paid to Rome. She continues, but Diocletian changed all of that. He subdivided the existing provinces into approximately 100, all told nearly twice what it had been. The provinces were furthermore organized into 12 dioceses, or seats of authority, and there were vicars, each in charge of a diocese, and many other lesser officials to rule successively smaller areas of concern. Now, it's important to establish that this is the understanding of these mountains and islands being displaced or moved out of their places. And another confirmation would be this Wikipedia article entitled Roman Diocese, which tells us 2 major reforms to the administrative divisions of the empire were undertaken during the Tetrarchy. The first of these was the multiplication of the number of provinces, which had remained largely unchanged since the time of Augustus. Now, this is Caesar Augustus of the time of Christ's birth. So from 48 provinces at the beginning of Diocletian's reign to around 100 by the time of his abdication. They tell us that the multiplication of the provinces was probably undertaken for military, financial, and economic reasons. Further substantiating this is Lactantius's excerpt from De Moribus Persecutororum. He was a Christian author born in 240 AD. He actually became an advisor to the Emperor Constantine. He guided his religious policies. He actually tutored his son, so he was pretty close to the heartbeat of things. And he writes, and so that everything would be filled with terror, the provinces were also sliced to bits. Many governors and more offices brooded over individual regions and almost every city, as well as many rationales, magistri, and vicari prefectorum, all of whose civil acts were exceedingly rare, but whose condemnations and proscriptions were common, whose exactions of innumerable taxes were not so much frequent as constant, and the damage from these taxes was unbearable. And finally, Diocletian from Humanities tells us that he also divided the empire into smaller provinces so that governors had an easier time with administration. These provinces were grouped into larger units called dioceses, overseen by an official called a vicar. Here's the important part. When Christianity moved from being an illegal cult to the official religion of the empire, the division of imperial territory into dioceses, overseen by vicars, would be adopted by the Catholic Church, and it persists all the way to the present in the administration of the Church. Now tuck this in your cap because we will be revisiting this again. This is a map that shows the diocese around AD 400. You can easily see the dividing and dissecting of the empire into all of these different smaller regions. Thus, Christine Miller says, boundaries, seats of government, and rulers all radically changed from the nations and patterns that they had followed for millennia. From 284 AD on, indeed, every mountain and island was moved from its place. I want to revisit this idea of all the kings of the earth, all the great men, all people hiding themselves. Okay, they hid in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Again, what has them running for cover? I mean, this is not the return of Jesus Christ. That doesn't happen until chapter 19. But this is telling us that these people attribute their terror to the wrath of Jesus, the Lamb. Now think about that for just a minute. Wouldn't it make more sense to be terrified of the lion from the tribe of Judah? Why fear the Lamb? Well, maybe it's because it's Jesus' death that won the victory. It's that single act that caused the downfall of the enemy's kingdom. You know, all those instructions about being a servant and humbling ourselves and taking the lower seats just comes flooding into my mind. That's where our real strength lies. The enemy isn't impressed by our strength or knowledge or wealth, but he trembles at our humility and compassion and love. Revelation 6, verse 15 through 17 indicates that the entire earthquake and upheaval would be identified with Jesus Christ. Those who dwell on the earth in Revelation we saw are the unbelievers. The Lord is giving us a picture of this slice of history as the unbelievers perceived it, from the small to the great. Therefore, the unbelievers trembled in fear from the wrath of the Lamb, knowing that their time is at an end. Now, I happen to believe that maybe this fear of God in the kings of the earth was a response from a twofold situation, perhaps. Besides the incredible etch-a-sketch that occurred with Constantine's ascension to the throne, well, storm clouds are gathering on the horizon. There's a feeling of impending doom, of what's coming next. Notice the dates here on this map showing future invasions of the Roman Empire. But some of these foreigners have already entered into the empire. They've migrated in, and Rome is watching its borders closely. In fact, Albert Barnes tells us that the most obvious and natural application of this seal seems to be demanded by the explanations given of the previous seals. It is, in one word, the impending judgments from the invasion of the northern hordes of Goths and Vandals, threatening the breaking up of the Roman Empire. The gathering of the storm, the hovering of those barbarians on the borders of the empire, the approaches which they made from time to time towards the capital, though restrained as yet from taking it, the tempest of wrath that was, as it were, suspended, yet on the frontiers, until the events recorded in the next chapter should occur, then bursting forth in wrath in successive blasts, as denoted by the first 4 trumpets of the 7th seal. The precise point of time which Mr. Barnes supposes this seal occupies is that succeeding the last persecution. So we begin to see why they're hiding, but why are they calling to the mountains and the rocks to fall on them? Well, Jack Wellman of Pathos.com suggests a possibility. He says the term or phrase, the rock, is more than just a word that describes an earthly element. It is typically about a person, and more often than not, it describes Jesus Christ. And you see this symbolism in the Old as well as the New Testament, referring to either Jesus Christ or God in general. He tells us that the word rock is used 142 times in the Bible, but it is more often a reference to God than any other instance. And he's exactly correct, you know. This is a picture, excuse me, of the split rock of Horeb in Saudi Arabia. If you haven't seen Jim and Penny Caldwell's The God of the Mountain, I encourage you to Google that. It's an amazing video showing not only this, but much of the Exodus story that we didn't learn growing up. But I just want to confirm that many biblical scriptures and passages refer to God as a rock. And I'm just going to quickly go through a few. Isaiah 26, Yahweh is an everlasting rock. Deuteronomy 32, He is the rock and His work is perfect. Psalm 18, the Lord is my rock and my fortress. 1 Corinthians 10, speaking about the Hebrews in the wilderness, Paul says, for they drank of this spiritual rock, and he was meaning Jesus, of course. 1 Samuel chapter 2, there is no rock like our God. And 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter quotes the prophets about Messiah. Behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect and precious. Clearly, it's a possibility. John is just telling us that these people are calling, these unbelievers are calling out to their gods, perhaps, right? Just like the Baal worshippers in the showdown with Elijah. And Elijah has to say, well, call out a little louder. Maybe he's sleeping. I mean, these pagans can't believe what their eyes are seeing. And it's quite possible that they are just calling out, trying to evoke their gods to counter this God of the Christians. John Gill, though, in his commentary on the whole Bible, suggests maybe even another reason that they're crying out to these rocks to fall upon them. Maybe he says they chose death rather than life. And he tells us that Diocletian, being invited by Constantine to a marriage feast, excused himself by reason of his old age. But receiving threatening letters, the historian says, in which he was charged with favoring Maxentius and Maximinus, he poisoned himself. And others of the emperors are said to lay violent hands upon themselves. Well, that's quite possible. Again, they can hardly believe what's going on, and rather maybe than face the truth of the God of the Christians, to confess they had been wrong, they might have chosen death. Baron John von Mueller kind of affirms this possibility. He tells us about this time the old Diocletian died, as it is reported by his own hand, indignant because the new emperors had expressed themselves ungraciously towards him on account of his absence from the marriage feast of Licinius. Now, lest we think this is far too fetched to be true, that emperors and the whole of the pagan world might begin to feel the pressure of Christianity to the point of, wishing themselves dead. We have to understand the scope of what was happening. Now, this is a picture of the conversion of Christianity, and what began with an obscure birth in tiny Bethlehem developed into a small movement in Galilee. And by the 3rd century, it had spread to much of the Roman Empire. Notice the dark blue areas. And in just the next 3 centuries, it will have become the predominant religion of the empire. That corresponds with the greenish blue areas. It's almost impossible to overstate the significance of that worldview change, but we have to grasp it in order to appreciate the change that's going to take place in just the next several chapters of the book of Revelation after Rome falls. If we don't understand these major events, we can't possibly understand the next several earthquakes, including the one that we currently are feeling. And John Gill also tells us that some of the prevailing personalities bowed the knee. Thus they owned the proper deity and almighty powers, God and Christ, which they had dreaded. So Maximinus, being afflicted with a most horrible disease, of which he died, asked pardon of the God of the Christians, and owned that he suffered justly for his reproaches of Christ. Licinius, who sometimes pretended to be a Christian and joined with Constantine, but afterwards revolted and fought against him, being conquered and taken, was put to death, at which time he and they that suffered death with him confessed that the God of Constantine was the only true God. Now, Christine Miller wraps this up for us by telling us something very important. Constantine took the banner of the cross and invoked the name of Jesus Christ. And he so conquered his enemies under it that the pagan emperors began calling on the God of the Christians to help them in battle. Pagan Rome knew its own history well enough. They knew that Diocletian had just spent 10 years so harshly persecuting the Christians, that the blood of the martyrs flowed freely and thickly, so much so that even the jaded Romans grew tired of the great slaughter. They justly feared the armies of Constantine, or the armies of the Lamb, as it seemed to them, bearing down on them and decisively winning victory after victory. Now, this is maybe too fairy tale-like to be believed, but it's the history that even the pagan emperors began calling on the God of the Christians to help them. They're desperate. They can't believe what they are seeing. It's like they're crying out to the skies, is anyone else up there? They can't believe what's happening to their world. And you know, everyone in that world, and for the next several centuries, they knew the ramification of what had just happened. It's only those of us in these modern times that fail to grasp its importance. Well, I told you that was an awful lot happening in this judgment. So I want to recap it very quickly, the symbolism and the fulfillment. The great earthquake was the great shift of tectonic proportions, realigning all earthly order in government, society, religion, and worldview, as Constantine ends the persecutions and favors Christianity. The sun and moon in total eclipse. Diocletian, as the invincible sun emperor, is removed from power and his dual emperor system completely discarded. Stars of heaven falling to the earth. Principalities as pagan deities, their worship and their temples are abandoned. The sky receding as a scroll. The spiritual authority of paganism lost the influence it had held since the time of the flood in Babel. Mountains and islands moved out of their places, as the boundaries of the ancient kingdoms and nations rearranged and their governments were replaced. And the wrath of the Lamb, the armies of the Christian Constantine bearing down on the armies of the pagan Roman emperors, inflicting defeat upon defeat, until all who were of the earth, of unbelief, were completely defeated and removed from power. You know, the historicist view doesn't attempt to make these events fit history, but rather aligns the historical events with these prophecies. This isn't about manipulation. It's an organic connection. They just fit, without interference, without contriving. And the odds of that being coincidental have got to be somewhere between slim and non-existent. And before we finish today's video about the victory of Christianity, in essence the fall of paganism, we need to talk about the parable of the wheat and the tares. We're going to begin with the definition, the biblical use of tare. It's an injurious weed, resembling wheat when it's young. Thanks to Matthew. Now let's quickly run through that parable. I'm going to begin with the element of the parable and then the interpretation, which Jesus himself gives just a few verses later. The parable goes that a man, Jesus Christ, planted good seed, children of the kingdom, in his field, the world. And while men were sleeping, his enemy, the devil, sowed tares, children of the wicked one, amongst the wheat. Now, before we finish this parable, let's just ask the point, why? Well, I think it's quite possible that evil was already lurking, even in the Garden of Eden, sown by an enemy, while men were sleeping. Isn't it quite interesting that the Lord put Adam in a deep sleep in order to create Eve? I wonder what was going on while he was doing that. What looked pristine and pure from man's perspective was already corrupted from God's view. But he had a plan. Back to the wheat and tares. The man, Jesus, tells his servants to let the wheat and the tares grow together because you can't always tell them apart until it's time for the harvest, which Messiah interprets as the end of the world. Now, I think what this parable teaches us is that likewise in this picture-perfect idea of glorious and victorious Christendom, the state of Christianity, the seeds already exist that will grow into a kingdom of tares. Now, Yahweh used Constantine to end the persecutions of believers by the hand of the Roman Empire, and the trumpet judgments that follow are going to take that beast down. Still, another beast is waiting in the wings and will rise up out of the sea. Now that's peoples, nations, and multitudes. And they're going to rise up right amongst the wheat and threaten the wheat's very existence. Now we're not going to see that beast rise up until chapter 13. But suffice it to say that there is no small uncertainty as to whether Constantine the Great was really great. There's room for questions. And according to Bruce Kaufman from the Tribune Star in his Emperor Constantine Changes the World, he tells us that most scholars agree that Constantine was a genuine believer. He immersed himself in the theological issues of the day. He supported the church financially and granted the clergy privileges. Now, at this point in history, the church is still standing on the faith once delivered to the saints. It's important to note that they are keeping the commandments of God and they are holding to the testimony of Yeshua, Jesus Christ. But that's all going to change very soon. Mr. Kaufman continues, but there is also no denying that from a political standpoint, uniting his empire under one religious orthodoxy based on a single God minimized both religious disputes and social instability. And that made his empire more peaceful, but also easier to control, which is why his promotion of many Christians to high office was probably as politically motivated as it was divinely inspired. And Britannica.com, the alliance between church and empire, we're told that Constantine completely altered the relationship between the church and the imperial government, thereby beginning a process that eventually made Christianity the official religion of the empire. Many new converts were won, including those who converted only with the hope of advancing their careers. Now they tell us that the church was also faced by a new form of governmental interference when Constantine presided at the Council of Nicaea. And still others will tell us that Constantine had his son and second wife executed in 326 AD, and that's well after he purportedly became a Christian. The reasons aren't clear for that, but it definitely leaves big question marks in the minds of most people. You remember Daniel's fourth beast? If you've just joined us, I cover Daniel's vision of the fourth beast of Rome in video 2, The Plot Thickens. Trying to follow Revelation without that important foundation leaves a person open to some of the misconceptions which abound about this book. So go back and look at that if you haven't had a chance to. But this is going to be a spoiler alert. It's the Roman Empire, its very self, that keeps those next beasts at bay, holding them back. As long as the Roman Empire is still breathing, the beasts of the sea and the land can't materialize. And this is a picture of Revelation's beast of the sea. It's a conglomeration of those 4 Gentile kingdoms that we saw in the book of Daniel. Do you notice the similarity between these 2 beasts? Now, we know that Daniel's 4th beastly kingdom is Rome, not because he told us. Remember, Rome didn't even exist on the radar screen at the time of Daniel. But Daniel did interpret the preceding 3 beastly kingdoms as Babylon, Media-Persia, and Grecia. And there's not a scholar alive that doesn't know Rome is the world empire that followed Greece. And in video 2, if you remember, I alluded to the fact that Daniel's vision of these beastly kingdoms was closely related to the beast of Revelation. Only in Revelation there's one beast, which is an amalgamation of Daniel's 4. we see the lion as Babylon, the bear as Media Persia, the leopard, four-headed leopard, as Grecia, and the dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong beast with great iron teeth as Rome. And so Rome, the Roman Empire, is one of that beast's heads. Again, Daniel saw these kingdoms as separate beasts, but John sees them as one. And in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation, verse 3, we read, "And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death." Now, there's not a whole lot of math that needs to be done right here. We now know what head would be wounded to death. You and I are watching its decline, and we're soon going to see its fall. But his deadly wound was healed. That same head is going to be revived. I'll let you sit on that for a few weeks. Next time on the Book of Revelation Historicist View, Part 10, the first interval. That seals it. This is our first interval, and remember, intervals are spiritual events that happen in heaven and occur between every sixth and seventh judgment. Now, sometimes they're subtle, but sometimes their ripple effect here on earth can be palpable. Chapter 7 of the book of Revelation covers this first interval, and it's all about conversion. I sure hope that you can join me, but until then, stay well, keep studying, and shalom.